Karen always dreamed of living a simple, peaceful life away from the noise and stress of the city. She had spent years working long hours in a corporate job, surrounded by concrete buildings, endless traffic, and people rushing past her without so much as a smile. But deep down, she yearned for something different, something quieter, calmer, and closer to nature. So, when she and her husband finally saved enough money to buy a small farm in the countryside, it felt like a dream come true. The farm wasn't huge, but it was perfect for their needs. It had everything they wanted: a cozy little farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a barn that needed some fixing up, and acres of land where they could grow vegetables, raise animals, or simply sit under the shade of tall trees. Karen fell in love with the place the moment she stepped foot on it. The air smelled fresh, the fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and the only sounds were birds chirping and leaves rustling in the breeze. For months after moving in, Karen threw herself into making the farm feel like home. She painted the old wooden fence white, planted rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and carrots in the garden, and even adopted a few chickens and goats to keep things lively. Every morning she woke up early to feed the animals, collect eggs, and check on the crops. By evening, she would sit on the porch with a cup of tea watching the sun dip below the hills. Life was good, simple, peaceful, just the way she liked it. But all of that changed one sunny afternoon when an unexpected visitor showed up on her property. It started innocently enough. Karen was inside the house, preparing lunch while humming, along to an old song playing on the radio. Through the kitchen window, she noticed movement near the edge of the field. A figure walking slowly, stopping occasionally to glance around. At first, she thought it might be one of her neighbors. Maybe someone had lost a pet or was looking for help. Curious, she put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and walked outside to investigate. As she approached, however, Karen realized this wasn't anyone she recognized. The man looked out of place, dressed in dark jeans and a plain gray hoodie despite the warm weather. He carried a clipboard in one hand and seemed to be jotting notes as he surveyed her property. His demeanor was calm, almost casual, but there was something about him that made Karen uneasy. Who was he? And why was he wandering around her land without permission? "Excuse me," Karen called out, trying to sound firm but polite. The man turned his head sharply, clearly startled by her voice. For a split second, their eyes met, and Karen felt a chill run down her spine. There was no warmth in his expression, just a cold, calculating gaze that sent alarm bells ringing in her. "Mind, yes?" the man replied, his tone clipped and uninviting. He didn't offer a smile or even a handshake. Instead, he stood there staring at her, waiting for her to speak again. "I'm sorry," Karen said, forcing herself to stay composed. "But can I ask what you're doing here? This is private property." The man glanced at his clipboard before answering. "Just checking some things," he muttered vaguely, not bothering to elaborate. His lack of explanation only fueled Karen's growing suspicion. "What kind of things?" she pressed, taking a step closer. "If you're lost or need directions, I can help you, but you really shouldn't be walking around someone else's property without asking first." The man let out a low chuckle, which did nothing to ease Karen's nerves. "Don't worry about it," he said dismissively. "You'll hear from me soon." Then, without another word, he turned and began walking back toward the road, leaving Karen standing there dumbfounded. Her heart raced as she watched him disappear into the distance. What had just happened? Why had he been snooping around her farm? And what did he mean by, "You'll hear from me soon"? None of it made sense, and the more Karen thought about it, the angrier and more frightened she became. She hurried back inside the house, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he a burglar casing her property? A scam artist trying to find vulnerable targets? Or maybe something worse? Whatever the case, Karen knew she couldn't ignore it. She picked up her phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the operator as calmly as she could. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived at her doorstep, ready to investigate. As Karen recounted the events to them, she couldn't shake. The feeling that this strange encounter was just the beginning of something far bigger and potentially far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The sound of sirens broke the usual calm of Karen's quiet farm as two police cars pulled up along the gravel driveway. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the white paint of the farmhouse, creating an eerie contrast to the peaceful surroundings Karen had grown accustomed to. Her heart was still pounding from the earlier encounter with the mysterious man, but now she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief because help had arrived, and apprehension because she wasn't sure what would come next. Two officers stepped out of their vehicles, both dressed in full uniform. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding but reassuring. The other was shorter, with a kind face that seemed more approachable. They walked toward Karen, who stood nervously on the porch, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, tipping his hat politely, "we got your call about a suspicious person on your property. Can you tell us what happened?" Karen nodded quickly, eager to explain everything while it was still fresh in her mind. She recounted the entire incident, the strange man walking around her fields, his clipboard, his vague answers, and the unsettling way he had dismissed her concerns before leaving. As she spoke, she gestured toward the area where she'd last seen him, pointing out the direction he had taken when he left. The officers listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in small notebooks they carried. When Karen finished speaking, the taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "All right, ma'am," he said. "We'll take a look around and see if we can find anything unusual. Do you mind showing us exactly where you saw him?" Karen hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to go back outside. It felt too exposed, too vulnerable, but she knew it was important to cooperate. Taking a deep breath, she led them down the path toward the edge of her property. Along the way, she pointed out details she remembered. The spot where the man had stopped to write something on his clipboard, the tree he had leaned against briefly, and the gate he had passed through before disappearing from view. As the group neared the field, Karen noticed something odd, a black SUV parked just beyond her fence line. It hadn't been there earlier when she called 911. The vehicle looked sleek and official, its shiny surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. Several people stood beside it, dressed in professional attire rather than casual clothes like the man Karen had encountered. One of them stepped forward, holding a similar clipboard, and began walking toward the group. Karen froze, her stomach sinking. Who were these people? Were they connected to the man who had been snooping around her property? Before she could say anything, the newcomer introduced himself. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly, extending a hand to the officers. "I'm Agent Mark Reynolds with the Department of Homeland Security." His voice was calm and authoritative, but there was an edge to it that made Karen uneasy. He turned his attention to Karen next, offering her the same polite smile. "And you must be Mrs. Karen," she replied stiffly, shaking his hand reluctantly. "What's going on here? Why are all of you on my property?" Agent Reynolds didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the officers, then back at Karen, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "We're conducting routine surveillance in this area due to its proximity to certain sensitive infrastructure. Your property falls within our scope of investigation." Karen blinked, struggling to process what he was saying. Surveillance. Sensitive infrastructure? None of this made sense. She lived miles away from any major roads or facilities. What could possibly be considered sensitive about her little farm? "I don't understand," Karen said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Why didn't anyone notify me beforehand? You can't just show up unannounced and start wandering around someone's private land." Agent Reynolds held up a hand, his expression placating. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize for the confusion. Normally, we do reach out ahead of time, but in this case, we were operating under expedited protocols. Time was of the essence." Karen crossed her arms over her chest, not entirely convinced. Something about his explanation felt off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the officers exchanging another glance, their expressions unreadable. Clearly, they weren't expecting federal agents to show up either. Before Karen could press further, Agent Reynolds shifted his focus back to her. "In light of the situation, may I please see some identification?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Karen frowned, caught off guard by the request. "Why do you need my ID?" she demanded. "I already told you who I am." "It's standard procedure," Agent Reynolds explained patiently. "Just a formality to confirm your identity and ensure everything is above board." Reluctantly, Karen reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. She fumbled through it, retrieving her driver's license and handing it over. Agent Reynolds studied it carefully, his brow furrowing slightly as he examined the details. Then, without warning, his demeanor changed. "Wait a minute," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the license to Karen and back again. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as if piecing together a puzzle. Slowly, he turned to the other agents standing nearby and gestured for them to lower their clipboards. Turning back to Karen, he spoke in a quieter, more measured tone. "Mrs. Karen, would you mind telling me about your background, specifically your previous employment?" Karen blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden shift in conversation. What did her job history have to do with anything? Still, she decided to answer truthfully. "I used to work as a federal investigator," she admitted cautiously. "But that was years ago. I retired and moved here for a quieter life." Agent Reynolds nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected this response. Without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge identical to the one Karen had carried during her career. He handed it to her, his expression unreadable. Karen stared at the badge in stunned silence. It was unmistakable. The emblem, the design, the insignia. She recognized it immediately. This wasn't just any federal agency. It was the very department she had once served. And judging by Agent Reynolds's reaction, he knew exactly who she was, or at least who she had been. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, and Karen's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't anyone told her about this operation? How did they not realize she was part of their own organization? And most importantly, what did this mean for her, and for her farm? As the pieces began falling into place, Karen realized that this situation was far more complicated and far more personal than she could have ever anticipated. Karen stared at the badge in her hand, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The weight of the metal felt familiar, yet alien at the same time. It had been years since she'd last held one like it, years since she'd left behind the life of a federal investigator for the simplicity of farm living. She thought those days were over, buried deep in the past, but now they seemed to be resurfacing in ways she couldn't have imagined. Agent Reynolds watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "You recognize this, don't you?" he asked, quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Karen nodded slowly, still clutching the badge. "Of course I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what does this have to do with me? I haven't worked in, well, a long time." Reynolds didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for everyone else to step aside, giving them some privacy. The officers and other agents retreated a few paces, though Karen could feel their eyes on her. Once they were alone, or as alone as two people could be with an audience lingering nearby, Reynolds spoke again. "Let me start by saying your reputation precedes you," he began, his tone respectful but serious. "In our line of work, names like yours don't fade easily. You were one of the best investigators we had, especially when it came to agricultural fraud and rural security threats. Your cases set precedents that are still referenced today." Karen's cheeks flushed despite herself. She wasn't used to being praised anymore. Her days of solving high-profile cases felt like another lifetime. But even as pride flickered, within her confusion quickly took its place. "If you know who I am, then why didn't anyone tell me about this operation beforehand? Why did I find out because of some random guy wandering around my property?" Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, Karen noticed how tired he looked. "It's complicated," he admitted. When we flagged your property for monitoring, we weren't aware of your connection to the agency. Our systems flagged it based on geographical data alone, its proximity to certain critical infrastructure, and assigned it to one of our field teams without cross-referencing ownership details. That's standard procedure to avoid bias or leaks. Karen raised an eyebrow skeptically. So no one thought to check whose land they were invading until just now? It's not ideal, I'll admit, Reynolds said with a grimace. But these operations move fast, and sometimes corners get cut. We're dealing with potential threats that require immediate attention. Still, I can see how this must have been unsettling for you. If I'd known earlier, I would have handled things differently. Karen crossed her arms, trying to process everything. While part of her appreciated the explanation, another part remained wary. Something about the whole situation felt off, like there was more to the story than Reynolds was letting on. Okay, she said finally, her tone firm. Even if I believe you, why is my farm suddenly so important? What kind of threats are we talking about here? Reynolds hesitated before answering, clearly choosing his words carefully. I'm not at liberty to share all the specifics, but I can give you the broad strokes. Recently, there's been an uptick in suspicious activity near key locations across the country. Power grids, water supplies, communication hubs. These areas are often overlooked because they're tucked away in rural settings, but they're critical to national security. Farms like yours, which sit close to such sites, become potential targets for exploitation. Karen's stomach churned at the thought. She had chosen this farm specifically for its isolation, thinking it would keep her safe from the chaos of the outside world. Now it seemed her sanctuary might actually put her in harm's way. And you think someone's targeting farms like mine? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Who would even do something like that? We're not sure yet, Reynolds admitted. That's part of why we're conducting surveillance, to gather intelligence and identify patterns. But, given your history, I suspect you understand better than most how creative criminals can be. They exploit weaknesses wherever they find them, and rural communities often lack the resources to defend themselves. Karen nodded reluctantly. He was right. She'd seen it firsthand during her career. People underestimated rural areas, assuming they were too small or insignificant to matter. But that very assumption made them vulnerable, easy targets for those looking to cause trouble. What happens now? Karen asked after a moment of silence. Do you expect me to just sit back and let you monitor my property? Or is there more to it? Reynolds smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. That depends on you, he said. Technically, we could continue our investigation without involving you further, but given your background, and the fact that you're already caught up in this, I thought it might make sense to bring you into the fold. At least partially. Karen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you help us, Reynolds replied simply. Not officially, of course, you're retired and we respect that. But your insights could prove invaluable. You know this land better than anyone, and you have experience spotting signs of trouble that others might miss. If you're willing, we'd appreciate your input. Karen stared at him, torn between indignation and curiosity. On one hand, she had left her old life behind for a reason. The stress, the danger, the constant pressure, it had taken a toll on her, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't moved to the countryside to dive back into that world. On the other hand, she couldn't deny the thrill of being needed again, of using her skills to protect something she cared about deeply. What exactly would helping you entail? She asked cautiously. For starters, keeping an eye out for anything unusual, Reynolds explained. We'll provide you with contact information so you can report anything directly to us. Beyond that, if you're comfortable, we'd like to brief you on our findings periodically. Your perspective could help us connect dots we might otherwise miss. Karen mulled it over, weighing the pros and cons. Part of her wanted to say no, to insist that they leave her alone and let her go back to her peaceful life. But another part, the part that had once thrived on solving puzzles and protecting innocent people, was intrigued. Maybe this was her chance to make a difference again, even in a small way. All right, she said finally, surprising herself, as much as Reynolds. I'll help, but on one condition: you keep me in the loop. No more surprises, no more strangers showing up unannounced. If something happens, you tell me first. Reynolds nodded, relief evident on his face. Deal, he said, extending his hand. Thank you, Karen. I promise you won't regret this. As they shook hands, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. Still, for the first time in years, she felt a spark of purpose, a reminder that even in retirement, her skills and knowledge still mattered. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it head-on. Karen's decision to help Agent Reynolds and his team marked the beginning of a whirlwind transformation in her life. What had once been a peaceful, predictable routine on the farm now became a delicate balancing act between her old world and her new responsibilities. Each day brought new challenges, surprises, and revelations that forced her to confront not only external threats, but also her own doubts and fears. The first thing Karen noticed was how quickly her role evolved from passive observer to active participant. At first, she thought her involvement would be minimal, just keeping an eye out for anything unusual and reporting it to the team. But as the days passed, Agent Reynolds began relying on her more and more. He would call her late at night or show up unannounced, though always with fair warning now, to discuss updates, share findings, and seek her opinion on matters ranging from surveillance strategies to potential suspects. Karen found herself drawn into conversations she hadn't anticipated. One evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a map of the surrounding area spread out before them, Reynolds explained the broader scope of their operation. Your farm isn't the only one under scrutiny, he said, pointing to several locations marked with red dots. These are all properties within a 10-mile radius of critical infrastructure. We've identified patterns of suspicious activity near each of these sites. Karen leaned forward, studying the map intently. What kind of activity? She asked. Small things, mostly, Reynolds replied. Unexplained foot traffic, strange vehicles parked nearby, drones flying overhead. Nothing concrete enough to take action, but enough to raise concerns. Karen frowned, her investigative instincts kicking in. If you're seeing similar patterns across multiple farms, it suggests coordination. Someone is deliberately targeting rural areas, not randomly, but strategically. Reynolds nodded approvingly. Exactly. And that's where your expertise comes in. You understand how criminals think. They exploit weak points, avoid detection, and adapt quickly when faced with obstacles. That's why we need someone like you who can anticipate their next move. Over time, Karen began noticing subtle changes around her property. Footprints appeared in the mud near the fence line. A drone buzzed overhead one morning, hovering just long enough to make her uneasy before disappearing. Even the local wildlife seemed skittish, as if sensing something amiss. She reported everything to Reynolds, who assured her they were piecing together a larger picture. But it wasn't just about gathering evidence. Karen realized she was also becoming a bridge between the federal agents and the farming community. Many of her neighbors grew suspicious when they saw unfamiliar cars driving through the area or helicopters circling above. Some even approached Karen directly, asking if she knew what was going on. At first, she hesitated to say too much, worried about jeopardizing the investigation. But eventually, she decided transparency was better than paranoia. She organized a small meeting at her barn, inviting a handful of trusted neighbors to hear her out. Standing in front of them, she explained the situation as best she could without revealing classified information. There's been some concern about security in our area, she told them. Nothing specific has happened yet, but authorities are taking precautions to ensure everyone stays safe. If any of you notice anything unusual, people trespassing, unfamiliar vehicles, or anything else, please let me know immediately. I'll pass it along to the right people. To her relief, her neighbors responded positively. They appreciated her honesty and trusted her judgment. Several promised to keep an eye out and report anything suspicious. In return, Karen made sure to keep them updated whenever possible, sharing general reassurances while avoiding details that might cause panic. As the weeks went by, Karen's confidence grew. She rediscovered skills she hadn't used in years: analyzing data, connecting seemingly unrelated events and thinking several steps ahead. Her mornings were spent tending to the animals and crops, while her afternoons often involved poring over reports or discussing strategy with Reynolds. By evening, she'd collapse onto her porch swing, exhausted but exhilarated. Yet despite her growing involvement, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming on the horizon. The pieces of the puzzle hadn't quite come together yet, and she sensed they were running out of time. Every clue pointed to a larger, more sinister plan, but the specifics remained elusive. One afternoon, while inspecting her fields, Karen stumbled upon something that sent chills down her spine. Near the edge of her property, partially hidden beneath a pile of brush, she discovered a small device no bigger than a matchbox. It looked innocent enough, a black box with blinking lights, but Karen recognized it instantly. A GPS tracker. Her heart raced as she picked it up carefully, wrapping it in a cloth to avoid tampering with any potential evidence. She called Reynolds immediately, her voice trembling with urgency. "Someone's been watching us," she said when he answered. "I found this on my land. Whoever planted it knows we're onto them." Reynolds arrived within minutes, his expression grave. After examining the tracker, he confirmed Karen's suspicions. "This confirms it," he said grimly. "We're dealing with professionals. Someone wanted to monitor our movements, and yours specifically." The discovery rattled Karen, but it also solidified her resolve. She realized that her farm wasn't just a target, it was a battleground. Whoever was behind these threats had underestimated her, and now she intended to turn the tables. That night, as she sat alone in her kitchen, Karen reflected on how far she'd come since the day she called 911. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into something far greater. She was no longer just a retired investigator or a humble farmer. She was a protector, a guardian of her land and her community. And though the road ahead promised danger and uncertainty, Karen knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The days following the discovery of the GPS tracker marked a turning point in Karen's journey. What had started as an accidental entanglement with federal agents now became a full-fledged mission to protect her farm, her neighbors, and the surrounding rural community. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was Karen's determination. She knew that backing down wasn't an option, not when her home and livelihood were at risk. Agent Reynolds wasted no time after examining the tracker. He called an emergency meeting at Karen's barn, bringing together his team and several key members of the local farming community. Karen stood beside him as he addressed the group, her presence signaling solidarity and trust. "We've confirmed that someone is actively monitoring this area," Reynolds announced, his tone serious but steady. "This isn't random trespassing or curiosity. It's calculated surveillance. Our priority now is to identify who's behind it and stop them before they escalate." Karen stepped forward, addressing her neighbors directly. "I know this is unsettling," she said, her voice firm yet reassuring. "But we're not defenseless. Together we can protect our land and each other. If you see anything unusual, vehicles, strangers, equipment, report it immediately. Even the smallest detail could make a difference." Her words resonated deeply with the farmers gathered there. Many nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting both concern and resolve. They trusted Karen, and her leadership inspired them to take action. Over the next few days, the community rallied together, forming a loosely organized network of watchful eyes. Neighbors checked in on one another regularly, shared information through phone calls and text messages, and even coordinated patrols during off hours. It was grassroots security at its finest, driven by people who cared about their homes and each other. Meanwhile, Karen worked closely with Agent Reynolds and his team to piece together the bigger picture. The tracker had provided valuable insight into how sophisticated their adversaries were, but it also raised new questions. Who exactly was orchestrating these operations? Were they targeting specific farms for personal gain? Or was there a larger, geopolitical motive at play? And perhaps most importantly, what would they do next? Karen spent hours poring over maps, analyzing patterns, and reviewing surveillance footage. Her investigative instincts sharpened with each passing day, reminding her why she had been so successful in her previous career. One evening, while studying a series of drone sightings reported by her neighbors, she noticed something peculiar. The drones always appeared in clusters, moving systematically from one farm to another. Their flight paths formed a grid-like pattern, almost as if they were mapping the terrain. "This isn't random reconnaissance," Karen told Reynolds the next morning, pointing out the anomaly on the map. "They're collecting data, probably creating detailed layouts of the area. But why?" Reynolds frowned thoughtfully. "If I had to guess, they're planning something big. Maybe an attack on the infrastructure nearby, using the farms as cover or staging grounds." Karen's stomach tightened at the thought. "Then we need to act fast. We can't wait for them to make the first move." With urgency mounting, the team devised a plan to catch the perpetrators in the act. Using decoy devices planted around Karen's property and neighboring farms, they hoped to lure the drones, or whoever was operating them, into revealing themselves. Karen played a crucial role in setting up the operation, leveraging her intimate knowledge of the land to position the decoys strategically. She also coordinated with her neighbors, ensuring everyone understood their roles without compromising safety. The waiting game began. For nearly a week, nothing happened. Tension hung thick in the air as Karen and her allies remained vigilant, scanning the skies and listening for any signs of activity. Then, late one night, the breakthrough came. Karen was sitting on her porch, sipping tea and staring out at the dark fields when she heard it, a faint buzzing sound cutting through the silence. Her heart skipped a beat as she grabbed her flashlight and binoculars, rushing toward the source of the noise. Sure enough, a drone hovered above one of the decoy locations, its lights blinking rhythmically as it transmitted data. Without hesitation, Karen radioed Reynolds. "We've got movement," she whispered urgently. "Sector 3, just like we planned." Within minutes, Reynolds and his team arrived armed with specialized equipment designed to disable the drone safely. As they worked, Karen kept watch, her senses on high alert. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, illuminating the edge of her property. A vehicle sped toward the scene, its engine roaring loudly. "Get down!" Reynolds shouted, pulling Karen behind a tree for cover. The car screeched to a halt near the decoy site, and two figures jumped out, frantically searching for the drone. Before they could react further, Reynolds' team moved in, apprehending them swiftly. It turned out the suspects were part of a larger criminal organization specializing in cyber attacks and sabotage. Their goal had been to gather intelligence on critical infrastructure sites, using rural farms as blind spots to avoid detection. Thanks to Karen's quick thinking and the collaborative efforts of the community, their plans had been thwarted. In the aftermath of the arrest, Karen found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for her neighbors, for Reynolds and his team, and, most of all, for the resilience she'd rediscovered within herself. The experience had reignited her passion for protecting others, proving that even in retirement, her skills and dedication still mattered. As life slowly returned to normal, Karen reflected on everything that had transpired. Her quiet farm had become more than just a place to escape the chaos of the world. It had become a symbol of strength and unity. Though she never expected to face such challenges again, she realized that sometimes the greatest battles are fought closest to home. And as for calling 911, well, let's just say Karen learned to double-check before jumping to conclusions. But deep down, she wouldn't trade the adventure or the lessons it taught her for anything.